Hello and welcome to Always Bored Never Boring. On my channel I cover a lot of fantasy and science fiction games, but today we are leaving behind the worlds of Eternia, the Mortal Realms, the Old World, the Imperium of Man, Middle-earth and wherever the heck HeroQuest is supposed to be set these days. We are instead travelling to 15th century Italy, where the Eternal City is in ruins and bands of mercenaries carry out the orders of warlords seeking to control the region. Because today we are looking at the Renaissance era miniatures game Force of Virtue from Masterstroke Games. To put this miniatures agnostic tabletop skirmish game through its paces, I was sent the special edition starter set, which comes in a tin and contains the rules, plus 4 decks of cards and all of the tokens, dice and reference sheets necessary to play. However, it is possible to try the game for yourself by visiting the Masterstroke Games website, where you can find pre-constructed warbands and tutorial scenarios. All you will need is a handful of 6-sided dice in 4 colours, a set of tokens in matching colours, a measuring tape and some suitable miniatures. The starter set is designed with the European Infantry's Mercenaries box from Perry Miniatures firmly in mind. That one box builds up to 40 miniatures, more than enough for 3 or 4 warbands, making it an excellent place to start. I have actually already made a video about that particular subject, so I'll link to it in the video description below and we can move straight on. Now I have to say, I am a complete dunce when it comes to this period in history. Fortunately, the team behind the game isn't. The designers are fencers, academics and historical reenactors, and they have poured all their love and knowledge into Force of Virtue. It shows. But the game is, I would say, green. It did initially present me with barriers to entry that I am sure could have potentially turned new players away. The rules book, which has since been revised and is available online, was not clear on some points, and I felt there was insufficient guidance for a new player on how to build a team and run a scenario. However, I stuck with it, and once I had drilled into the system, I found a fascinating and engaging experience with some really clever mechanisms that create a fresh and inventive style of gameplay. Which is a long-winded way of saying, it's a pretty fun game despite being a bit rough around the edges. To begin, you need to create your warband, which involves selecting a predetermined number of cards from various decks. For example, a good size for a beginner's game is 10 cards. There are 3 different types of deck: nation, character and scenario, and when you create your force you are allowed to select a total of 3 decks. Up to 2 of those decks can be nation decks and up to 3 can be character decks. Additionally, you can pick 1 scenario deck. The decks you choose will help to shape the narrative of your force. For this review I had access to Swiss and Condottieri nation decks, 1 Saints and Sinners character deck, which contains cards for customizing your force to be a group of mercenaries or a group of religious fanatics, and 1 Rise of the Borgias scenario deck, which includes cards themed around the chaos ensuing from conflicts within the Eternal City. And this idea of combining decks to create your team was really interesting to me, because it leans so heavily into the idea of creating a story, which is something I have always loved to do. For example, you could use 2 different nation decks plus the Saints and Sinners deck to create a beleaguered force that has had to resort to foreign mercenaries. You can then draw from a scenario deck to add flavour specific to the upcoming battle, perhaps drawing on cards that would give you the upper hand when street fighting, or that would give you a better chance of holding together a motley crew who only care for the money they will get for a job well done. Alternatively, you could select 3 character decks to create a lone soldier who holds allegiance to no country and cares only for the thrill of battle. Each deck includes a variety of different cards that you will use to construct your warband and shape your identity on the tabletop. There are logistics cards representing capos or leaders, troops and equipment. No more than 50% of your total force can be logistics cards. There are honour cards that represent special training and skills, strategy cards that represent the abilities of great leaders, intrigue cards that are underhanded plots and clever schemes, and then there are virtue cards, which as you can probably guess are the very heart of the game. They reflect the personality, training, skill and leadership abilities of your capos and veteran fighters. And the virtue system in this game is, well frankly it's brilliant. It's the kind of game system that I could make a whole video about. It's also the kind of game system that warranted a little trip to Google to learn a few things so that I could sound like I knew what I was talking about in this video. Force of Virtue works on the basis that there are 4 fighting virtues, and this is a very real concept derived from historical texts. In particular, the works of the 14th century fencer Fiore de Libere, who wrote the Flos Duelatorum. This manuscript defined the 4 virtues of a swordmaster and the animals associated with them. Prudence, depicted as a lynx holding a compass, Celerity or Speed, depicted as a tiger holding an arrow, Audacity, depicted as a lion holding a heart, and Fortitude, depicted as an elephant carrying a tower. So when you create your warband, you will assign some of these virtues to your leaders and veteran troops, and this will dictate how they will operate on the battlefield. Assign your leader with the virtue of Prudence and he will be insightful and precise, but possibly overcautious. Assign him Audacity and he will have the heart of a lion, but may be prone to rushing into dangerous situations without due care. Exactly how this manifests on the tabletop we will look at more closely in a moment, but it underpins every element of the gameplay. For now, let's go back to our cards and put together a 10 card warband for a condottieri force. I had this idea of 3 brothers who had become mercenaries, each bringing a valuable skill to the team. The linchpin of the force will be a banner bearer. Banners are a type of logistics card called a capo or leader, which means they can use their virtue to command other models within their command range of 6 inches. But at the moment, our banner doesn't have any virtue, so we need to assign him a virtue card. I'm going to use this one, which gives him 1 Fortitude, 1 Prudence and 1 Audacity, making him very balanced and well rounded. Oh, and I do just want to point out, these cards are actually rather nice. The fonts and icons can be a little crude and do have a little bit of a clip art feel to them, but the card quality is good and I love the use of real paintings. It's fun to play an intrigue card with a picture of Machiavelli on it. Of course, our banner bearer needs some troops to lead, so for our second logistics card I'm selecting a group of 3 mercenaries. We can arm them with halberds, which are heavy bladed weapons with an improved chance of causing wounds, or we can give them pikes, which have a longer reach. I'm going with pikes. Now, if I wanted to give them something else, maybe spears or crossbows, I could do that, but I would have to assign a suitable logistics card to them. Now, do be aware, these mercenaries do not have their own virtue. That means they can't do anything without being commanded by a capo. Furthermore, if at the end of a game round they are outside of the command range of a capo with virtue, they will flee the battlefield. This becomes a big part of the strategy on any given turn of the game, ensuring your warband maintains coherency and the chain of command is unbroken. It is possible to upgrade troops to veteran status, and if you do this you can give them their own virtue. In effect, they are skilled enough to be able to look after themselves and make plans if their boss isn't around. However, that all costs extra cards, so we're not going to do that. If you recall, I said I wanted this warband to be about 3 brothers. For our second brother I want a knight, a violent sort who doesn't care about giving orders but likes to lead from the front. This is another logistics card, another capo, but unlike the banner bearer, I'm not going to assign him any virtue. He will take his orders from the banner bearer as he gets stuck into combat with the mercenaries. I'm going to equip him with a mace, a suitably brutal weapon for a brutal man, and to keep him in the fight I'm going to use an additional logistics card to equip him with some Milanese plate armour. Most anything will ping straight off that. For our final brother I am digging into the Saints and Sinners deck for a marksman, a skilled fighter with a heavy crossbow. As a capo he could have the ability to command other troops, but I want him to be a lone agent, an assassin with the skills to move into position and look after himself. To that end I am giving him a virtue card that grants him 2 speed and 1 prudence. I think this nicely reflects his ability to move swiftly into position before making precise shots with his crossbow. At this point we have 7 cards in our warband, 5 of which are logistics. And because no more than 50% of the cards in the warband can be logistics, we now need to look at options from the honour and strategy cards. I have a great card here for our marksman. It is not titles that honour men, but men that honour titles. It reduces his command range to 0, which means he cannot give orders, and it also prevents him from taking orders from other capos, but it does let him re-roll his shoot and fight actions. I think that plays very nicely into the idea of him being a lone assassin. Finally, I want a couple of sneaky tricks that I can keep in my hand that my opponent won't know about until I play them. The first is As the Lion. I can play this at any time to give a capo 2 audacity. The idea here is that if my banner bearer is killed, my knight will be enraged and will gain 2 audacity, giving him the virtue necessary to take control of the force and command the mercenaries, but using his own, rather more aggressive style. The final card is Necessity of the Past. It's a simple utility card that you can play to cancel another player's intrigue or honour card. And that is our 10 card warband. I didn't use any scenario cards here because this is a sort of generic team for any encounter. If they were required to face overwhelming odds or deal with particular types of terrain, then I could go to a scenario pack and see if I could swap out cards like Necessity of the Past for something more specific to my immediate needs. It may seem like I'm dwelling on this element of the game, but I find it absolutely fascinating. The way you not only create a warband, but also build the personality of your leaders and the backstory that brought them to this confrontation is ingenious and so much fun. And by using cards, you don't have to worry about adding up points. You can create unusual situations where, for example, a force that might otherwise be outgunned can draw from scenario packs to gain enough advantages to take on a much stronger opponent. And you can even try out draft games with players drawing from random allocations of cards to see what they can come up with. The only real downside is the need to purchase multiple card packs to have access to every option, although it is still possible to make a warband using just one deck if you really want to. Once both players have a team, they need a reason to fight. You can make up a scenario, download one from the Masterstroke Games website, or use the scenario generator in the rules to make one randomly. Generally speaking, Force of Virtue is not about pitched battles where the aim is to rout your opponent, although routing is a viable course to victory. Nobody in the Eternal City fights without good calls, so there are normally objectives, markers on the board that need to be claimed and interacted with. Perhaps the objective is a valuable relic that you must steal, or a spy with important information for your warlord. Again, these objectives can be randomly determined using the scenario generator, but this is one of those games where you will probably get more out of it the more you put in. Crafting your own stories, building the legend of your mercenary team is part of the appeal. With the field of battle laid out and the attackers and defenders arranged for war, it's time to begin the game. A skirmish plays out in rounds, and during a round players will alternate taking turns. On your turn, you can do one of three things. You can sound the retreat. This, of course, will end the battle, so you don't really want to do it unless your situation is untenable. You can also pass. This means you will take no further turns in this round, although you can still play any cards from your hand. If both players have passed, the round ends. Most of the time you are going to select one capo to instigate an action, and that will commonly involve spending virtue. The available actions are move, shoot, reload, fight, rally and interact, and honestly, getting your warband to do any of this stuff requires a good degree of concentration, coordination and a little bit of bookkeeping. Let's say, for example, our banner bearer wants to sound the advance. First we decide who he is going to command. He can command himself and any other models within his 6-inch command range. However, all of the commanded models must have an available action and available faith. A model's action characteristic indicates how many times it can take an action during a round, and a model's faith characteristic indicates the total number of virtue that it can use during a round. So, our banner bearer decides he wants to sound the advance using 1 prudence and 1 audacity virtue. He selects 2 of the 3 pikemen to make this action. After moving, the pikemen will have 1 faith remaining. They started with 3, but it cost 2 faith to move because the banner bearer used 2 virtue to instigate the action. They will also have 1 action remaining because they started with 2 and moving only costs 1 action. The third pikeman that didn't move still has 3 faith and 2 actions remaining. The banner bearer also still has 3 faith and 2 actions remaining because he elected not to move himself with the pikemen, even though he instigated the action. However, he only has 1 virtue left, a fortitude. Virtue is tracked with plastic tokens of the relevant colour on the capo's logistics card. As you use the virtue tokens, they are set aside until the next round. And that may sound a little fiddly, and I guess it sort of is, and it may sound a little ponderous, and I guess it sort of is, but it's not as complicated as it probably sounds listening to my explanation. At first it may seem like a lot to track, the command range of the capos, the available types of virtue, the actions and the faith, but after a while the idea does click and managing your troops becomes an enjoyable puzzle. Maintaining the coherency of your fighting force, making sure troops have the right virtue at the right time, and making sure the line of command doesn't break down gives the game a unique feel. Your capos become integral connections in a networked command structure. They hold your line together, and should they fall, whole sections of your force will evaporate as untrustworthy mercenaries sense a shift in fortune's favour, make like a tree, and leave. This forces you to approach the game from a slightly different angle. Rarely will you have individual characters racing off to do something alone, unless you built a character for that purpose, like my marksman. you have to be careful and methodical as you manage your available resources. The only way to move beyond the hierarchy of the command system is to upgrade some of your troops to veterans. This gives them a pool of virtue they can access, but only to command themselves. This is quite expensive in terms of the cards necessary to set it up, but adds incredible flexibility to your force, because the veterans won't waver just because a capo falls in combat. Furthermore, even if the veteran troops are split up, they can all still access the same pool of virtue and activate together. In other words, veterans feel like veterans. They can hold the line if your capos are out of position, shore up gaps in your formations, and look after themselves when they need to. So, virtue is the resource necessary to make your troops do useful things. But why are there 4 types? That's the really clever bit. When you move, shoot, or fight, the virtue you use for that action is converted into virtue dice of the same colour. You will roll all of the dice and then select a single dice to apply the result. Any ones you roll are critical fails, and 6s are critical successes. But what makes it so clever is the colour of the dice, combined with the action you are taking, determines what happens when there is a critical success or critical failure. For example, if you are making a move action and roll a critical failure on a prudence dice, the moving models will move away from the nearest enemy unit as they are overcautious. However, if they roll a critical success, they gain 1 free defense dice until the next time they activate, as they are well prepared for whatever the enemy may do next. This lends so much character to your force and opens up many interesting decisions. Do you spend just 1 virtue knowing there is an increased risk of getting a critical failure, or do you spend lots of virtue to improve your chances of a good roll even though it will limit your total number of actions for this game round? If you need to march your force into battle, do you spend speed virtue, which will grant you an extra 3 inches of movement on a critical success, or do you choose prudence, which means your advance will be slower but you will be in a stronger defensive position? And what about when you are engaged in melee? Will you select Prudence, which improves the accuracy of your attacks to penetrate enemy armour? Speed, which can grant an additional attack? Audacity, which can force your opponent to burn their unused virtue, starving them of vital resources? Or Fortitude, which allows you to push deeper into enemy formations, disrupting their lines of command? Or maybe you will spend a variety of virtue all at once, which may give you more flexibility in commanding the outcome of the action. I think this is a fantastic system. It's clever, gives you loads to think about, creates lots of interesting choices, and feels very right, very accurate. Your capos are giving orders in a way that reflects their personalities, and the troops become an extension of their character. And you effectively have 4 different ways to approach the most commonly performed actions. It's uncommon for a game to present you with not only the question will you charge, but also how will you charge? Let's take a closer look at these various actions. Moving is relatively straightforward. You select the models to move and then roll the virtue dice. You select 1 dice for the result. A roll of 1 or 2 is a move of 4 inches, 3 or 4 is 5 inches, and 5 or 6 is 6 inches. And bear in mind, a 1 will apply a critical fail, while a 6 will apply a critical success. All of the selected models are free to move independently in any direction they choose, but must finish their movement within the command range of the capo that made the order. Every model also has a 1-inch control zone, and models aren't allowed to move into an enemy's control zone unless they are going to fight them. And of course, there are rules for moving through different types of terrain, all the stuff you would expect from a skirmish game. But there is one particularly unusual element to movement, and I admit it was a head scratcher for me. It's probably the rule that caused me the most hang-ups. Force of Virtue doesn't have a compound charge action. There is no way to move and immediately attack. Instead, all of the models that make a move remember the virtue that was used to move them. The next time those models activate, as long as they are making a fight action or a fight reaction, they can use the same virtue that they used to move, at no additional cost in actions, faith, or virtue. However, in order to do this, they must still be in the command range of the capo that instigated the original move action. Furthermore, if the capo has additional virtue available, he can add that with no additional cost in actions, although faith restrictions would still apply. Phew. As a simple example, let's look at our banner bearer. He performs a move action for himself and the knight. He uses 1 fortitude and 1 prudence, and they both move. This costs them both 1 action and 2 faith. Next, a rival team of pikemen move into combat with them. Then it is time for the knight and banner to activate again. Because they haven't performed any actions since they moved, and because they are both within the banner's command range, they remember that they have 1 Prudence and 1 Fortitude virtue, and they can now use those virtue to attack. But, just to be sure, the banner bearer decides to also add his remaining Audacity virtue, giving the models 3 dice to roll in the fight. I suppose we better talk about the fight action. Once again, you select a capo to instigate the action, even though they may not be part of the fight themselves. You then select all of the models that will fight and who they will target. Models must always target the closest untargeted enemy, and attacks must be divided as equally as possible. At this stage, your opponent can elect to make a fight reaction, which allows their targeted models to roll dice in retaliation. This is treated like a normal fight action with all the normal rules and restrictions, so the defenders must have a capo in range. And of course, if the models making a fight reaction had previously moved, they would remember the virtue that they used for that movement. Then the involved combatants decide how they will divide their available virtue between attacking and defending. All models on the same side must have the same distribution of attack and defend dice. Then you determine the order of attacks. Every attack has a range in inches from 0 inches, meaning you must be in base contact, up to 2 inches. Models with a longer reach may attack first, and may also be able to attack from a position where their target cannot fight back. Also, models with reach can attack over the heads of other friendly models, although when determining the order of attacks, a model is considered to be 1 degree slower for each model they are reaching over. In other words, a model with a reach of 1 fighting over the head of an ally will fight at the same time as a model with a reach of 0. Having determined the sequence of the attacks, you make them one at a time. Each combatant will have access to all of the virtue dice you allocated to attacking, so you roll those dice and you select one result. You will score a successful hit if your roll is equal to or greater than your model's 2 hit value. Remember, a 1 is a critical fail, a 6 is a critical success, and the nature of those critical results will be determined by the type of virtue dice you used. If the model you targeted has some virtue dice allocated to defense, they then roll those dice, comparing them to their own 2 hit value. If they succeed, they block the attack, but note that they must roll a critical success in order to defend a critical strike. If the model doesn't have any defense or fails the defense roll, then the strike is successful. The target must then make an armor save. To do this, roll 1 dice and compare the result to the model's armor save, taking into account any modifiers from the attack. If the result is equal to or greater than the armor value, the hit is deflected at the last moment. A critical success always succeeds, a critical failure always... well, you get the point. And if the armor save has failed, the attack penetrates the armor. It's a crushing or accurate strike that shakes the defending force to the core. The defending player must immediately burn a virtue on a capo within command range, if available. Burnt virtue tokens are flipped over and will not be refreshed at the beginning of the next turn. If the capo doesn't have any unburnt virtue, he instead gains a panic token. That's really bad. The combat is turning against him, and he can see his best laid plans crashing down around him. The bad news doesn't end there. The target of the attack must now make a wound save. This is another dice roll compared to the wound save of the target. If this roll is failed, a capo within range can burn a fresh, that means unused, virtue token to force a reroll. If the reroll is a fail, or the player doesn't have virtue to burn, the target is killed and removed from the battlefield. This process is repeated for every model involved in the combat. And for me personally, the fighting is my least favourite part of the game, which I guess sounds pretty awful when you are talking about a skirmish game. There's no denying it's clever. There is a lot to think about, a lot of strategy, and as with much of the game, it captures a real sense of what these kinds of skirmishes might have been like, the way each fighter works independently but still relies on the presence of capos to bind them in the conflict. The attacks and counterattacks, the switches in tactics, the use of polearms to strike first from a safer range, the way morale erodes with each successful hit. But ultimately, I find it a bit hard to track and organise. Remembering virtue from previous move actions, ensuring you have capos in range, declaring fight reactions, figuring out the order of attacks, allocating the attack and defend dice, and then working through each roll feels a little sludgy. With time and experience, you can get much quicker at processing all the information, but I do think it lacks some of the immediacy that you might expect in a small-scale skirmish game. Shooting works in a very similar way, but is a little more streamlined. You select your capo to instigate the action, and then pick all the models you would like to shoot with. Models have to have line of sight to shoot at someone, cannot shoot at models that are in base-to-base contact with a friendly model, and they normally have to select the closest target. Each model will then roll their virtue dice and select a single result. As with melee, they must match or exceed their 2 hit value, with 1s being a critical fail and 6s being a critical success. Targets will only get a defense roll if they have cover from terrain, otherwise they have to rely on their armor, or failing that, a successful wound roll. All the same rules apply as for melee, with capos being forced to burn virtue when nearby models fail an armor save. Many of the weapons used for these ranged attacks require reloading before they can be used again, and the time this takes is represented by a reload value on the weapon profile. For example, a heavy crossbow is reload 2, which means you need to accrue 2 reload markers on a model before it can use its crossbow again. There is a special reloading action for this. As always, a capo has to instigate the action using virtue. The dice are then rolled and you select one result. A critical fail applies 0 reload markers, a roll of 2 to 5 applies 1, and a critical success applies 2. It may take several attempts to accrue enough reload markers to use the weapon again, and this can lead to tense moments as melee troops close in on your ranged fighters. The final 2 actions are only for capos or veteran troops, and they do not cost any virtue to use, although you still have to spend an action point. The rally action is crucial for holding firm in the face of adversity. If a capo has any burnt virtue or panic tokens and they are not in base-to-base contact with an enemy model, they can attempt to steal their resolve with this action. They roll dice equal to their total virtue, whether it's burnt, used or fresh, and for each 6 they can recover 1 burnt virtue token or remove 1 panic token. All panic tokens must be removed before any burnt virtue can be recovered. The burnt virtue comes back spent, so will not be available until the following turn. Rallying is crucial because at the end of the turn, if a capo has no unburnt virtue, they will flee the battlefield. Additionally, any model that's outside of the command range of a capo with unburnt virtue will also flee. Often you will have something you need to do urgently, but instead you end up spending all of your actions just holding your team together. The final action is Interact, which normally involves the objective for the scenario you are playing and could be talking to a spy to gain information, threatening a mayor, paying off a debt, or whatever else you have conjured up for your game. To perform the action, the capo must be in base-to-base contact with the objective, but not in base-to-base contact with any enemies. The first time the capo takes the action, they roll 6 dice, and attempt to arrange them in a sequential numerical order. For an easy interaction, they need a sequence of 3 numbers, but for a hard interaction, they need a sequence of 6 numbers. The sequence can start at any number and will wrap around from 6 to 1, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is a valid sequence, and so is 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. If the capo fails the interaction, they can lock in any dice that have formed part of the sequence. The next time they perform the interact action, they will only roll dice that were not locked in, so over time they will build the complete sequence they need. And that is pretty much it in terms of rules. There are of course rules for terrain, fighting across walls and hedges, stringing together battles into a campaign and so on, but this is the core experience. Activating capos to perform moving, shooting, reloading and fighting actions, then rallying and interacting when necessary. The battle will continue in rounds, with players refreshing all of their spent, unburnt virtue at the beginning of each new round, until the scenario objective has been met, in which case the game ends immediately. The game will also end if one player sounds the retreat, or they have no capos with unburnt virtue at the start of a turn and no way to gain more by playing a card. And I like it. I think it is a little clunky in places. Fighting doesn't feel quite as smooth as it could be, and I'm not totally sold on this idea of troops that fight having access to the virtue they used to move previously. But it is a unique system with a lot to enjoy. I think the virtue system is incredible. I love the idea of being able to perform the same stock actions in different ways to get different results, and building a strong warband feels very rewarding. I would describe this as a thinky game. It's not a pick up and play experience. You need to dedicate a certain amount of effort. You need to learn how to build an effective team and then run that team on the tabletop. You need to experiment with your options, figure out how you can stagger your combat line, where exactly to position your capo so that you can cover the ground necessary without losing efficiency. Or worse, losing chunks of your fighting force. It doesn't feel quite as slick and quick as many other skirmish games, and at times it demands a little more from you. But that in itself isn't a bad thing, it's just a different thing. Maybe it's your thing. If it is possible to try out the game using the resources on the Masterstroke Games website, or you can dive right in and visit the shop to buy what you need to get going. The link is in the video description. And if you really like what you see here, you might also be interested in the upcoming Kickstarter campaign, which is going to introduce new concepts like sieges and cavalry. There is a link to the campaign preview page in the description below. Head on over there and hit notify me on launch so that you can see what else Masterstroke Games have in store. All that's left is for me to say thank you to Masterstroke Games for sending me the starter set for review, and to say thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please consider pressing the like button. If you really like the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so, and hopefully I'll see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone, bye bye.